The Figure in the Shadows by John Bellairs, Chapter 12. Jonathan, Rosarita, and Mrs. Zimmerman stumbled across the snow-covered field. They were headed toward a little grove of pine trees. Jonathan was in the lead, and he played the flashlight beam over the footprints they were following. Though they could be seen quite clearly by the light of the moon, the ground was uneven under the smooth layer of snow, and every now and then one of the three would stumble and fall, but in spite of this they pressed on. As they got closer to the dark grove of trees, each of them had the same feeling about it, though nobody spoke. They all felt that the trees were like a curtain, hiding some scene from their eyes. They pushed on into the mass of fragrant boughs and shoved them aside, and there, on the other side of the grove, they stopped. Jonathan, Rosarita, and Mrs. Zimmerman found that they were standing at the top of a low hill. At the bottom of the hill, a wide space had been cleared in the snow. In the center of the patch of bare ground was a large well. Its top lay even with the ground, and nearby lay a heavy stone cover. Lewis stood a few feet away from the lip of the well, and a dark shape stood by the well, beckoning for Lewis to come. Jonathan, Rosarita, and Mrs. Zimmerman watched in horror. They could do nothing. Again the figure beckoned. Lewis stiffened, but he did not move. Then the figure raised its hand and made a strange sign in the air. Lewis shuffled a few feet closer. Now he was almost at the edge of the well. "Stop!" cried Mrs. Zimmerman. Her voice was loud and resonant, as if she were speaking under a dome. Rosarita turned and looked at her. Mrs. Zimmerman had changed. The folds of her ratty old purple cape were filled with orange light. A pale, flickering light played over her homely, wrinkled face, and in her hand, instead of an umbrella, she held a tall rod topped by a crystal sphere. Within the sphere a purple star burned, and threw a long violet slash, like a growling sword, across the snow. "I command you to stop!" Mrs. Zimmerman shouted again. The dark shape hesitated. Lewis stood motionless a few feet from the pit. Then a battle began. It was like giant flashbulbs going off all over, all at once. It was like thunder, not only overhead, but in the air, all around and under the earth. Rosarita fell to her knees in the snow and hid her face. When she raised her eyes again, the world lay in gray moonlight. Lewis had rushed back to the outer edge of the wide circle of snow, but the dark figure was still there by the well, and Mrs. Zimmerman lay crumpled in the snow. Near her lay the twisted wreckage of an old umbrella. The crystal knob had been shattered, as if by the blow of a hammer. Mrs. Zimmerman had lost. Rosarita sprang to her feet. She wanted to help Mrs. Zimmerman and help Lewis, to do everything all at once, save everybody, but she couldn't do anything. Jonathan was bending over Mrs. Zimmerman. It looked like he was trying to help her up. Rosarita whirled frantically and looked down the hill. Lewis was shuffling toward the well once again. The dark figure kept motioning him forward, waving its arms in strange rhythmical gestures. Then Rosarita heard Mrs. Zimmerman's voice. It was weak and raspy, like the voice of someone who has been sick for a long time. "Rita, come over here. Come over here quick." Rosarita thrashed through the snow till she was at Mrs. Zimmerman's side. "Hold out your hand," Mrs. Zimmerman barked. Rosarita held out her hand. Mrs. Zimmerman reached into her pocket and pulled out what looked like a piece of phosphorescent chalk. When she put it in Rosarita's hand, it burned like an icicle. "Take this and go to him. It's our only chance. Go on, run before it's too late." Rosarita took the thing in her fist and started down the hill. She expected it to be hard going, but it was strange. It seemed as if the snow was giving way in front of her. Before she knew it, she was standing in the strange circular clearing. The shadow was still beckoning to Lewis. It took no notice of her. And now Rosarita was filled with anger at this horrible creature that was trying to kill Lewis. She wanted to rush at it and tear it to shreds. Was that what she was supposed to do? Kill it? With the thing Mrs. Zimmerman had put in her hand? Or should she go straight to Lewis? She didn't have to make up her mind. Lewis's feet were touching the rock rim of the well. A slight push would send him plunging head first into darkness. With a loud screech, Rosarita ran forward. "Get away from him! Get away from him! Don't you dare touch him, you filthy, rotten thing!" she yelled. The shadow turned and faced Rosarita, and now it charged. Before, it had been a hooded, muffled shape. Now it was a ragged, spindly silhouette. A blackened, shrunken corpse with living eyes. It moved toward her with outstretched, hungry arms, and Rosarita heard what it was saying. She heard the words in her brain, although no sound was uttered. The thing was saying that it would wrap its arms around her and dive with her to the bottom of the dark, icy well. And there they would be together, face to face, forever. Rosarita knew that if she thought, she would faint or die. She clenched her teeth and rushed forward, saying over and over to herself the meaningless words of a commercial she had heard on the radio the other day. Use wild root cream oil, use wild root cream oil, Charlie. Use wild root cream oil, Charlie. Use. The fearful shape rushed at her, and for a moment there was blackness all around her, and the sickening, stifling smell of wet ashes, and then she was past it and standing by Lewis's side. Lewis was actually teetering on the edge of the well. He had put one foot forward into nothingness, like somebody testing the water before he goes in. With a hard shove, Rosarita pushed him sideways and back. Now her hands were around his neck, groping for the chain. Lewis did not resist. He acted like somebody who had been drugged. Still, it was hard for Rosarita to get the chain off, because she had to hang on to the cold, glowing object Mrs. Zimmerman had given her. She had a pretty good idea of what would happen to her if she let go of it. With a jerk, Rosarita pulled the chain up over Lewis's ears. She had it wadded in her hand now. When she turned toward the well, she saw the shape muffled in the darkness once again. It stood watching. Rosarita felt suddenly calm and triumphant. "You see this?" she shouted, waving the amulet. "We'll take a good look!" And with that she flung the coin, chain and all, into the well. There was a long second while the amulet fell, and then, from far below, came a tiny sound. Plip! And with that, the dark, hooded form vanished. It turned into a wisp of black smoke, and was whipped away by the wind. Nothing was left, not even a smudge on the ground. Rosarita stood, looking down into the well. It fascinated her. For a moment, the well seemed like the only thing in the world. It was a great black whirlpool that would swallow her up. It was a dead eye socket, looking out of nothing into nothing. Rosarita was caught in a sick, convulsive shudder. She trembled from head to foot, but when she stopped trembling, her mind was clear. She stepped back from the edge of the well and turned to see if she could help Lewis. Lewis was sitting on the ground crying. His face was raw and red from wind and snow and cold. His gloves were gone, his hat was gone, and there was a big piece torn out of his trouser leg. The first thing he said was, "Rosarita, do you have a handkerchief? I have to blow my nose." Weeping with joy, Rosarita threw her arms around Lewis and hugged him tight. Now Jonathan and Mrs. Zimmerman were with them. They were crying too, but eventually Mrs. Zimmerman pulled herself together. She knelt down next to Lewis and started examining him like a doctor. She looked into his eyes, into his ears, and down his throat. She made him stick out his tongue and say, "Ah!" Jonathan and Rosarita stood near, tense and nervous, waiting for Mrs. Zimmerman's verdict. Finally, she stood up. She shook snow out of her cape and smoothed down her dress. "All that's wrong with him," she snorted, "is that he's been out in the weather too long. He's exhausted, and I think he has a cold. Rosarita, would you hand me the thing I gave you?" Suddenly, Rosarita remembered the object that had saved her. It was still in her hand, though it no longer glowed or felt cold. She opened her fist, and there was a glass tube about 2 inches long. Inside the tube was a perforated metal sleeve, and inside that were some pale violet crystals. On the end of the tube was a shiny gold-colored metal cap. There were words stamped onto the top of the cap. "Peerless. Nasal inhalator. Regulation U.S. Patent Office." Rosarita turned to Mrs. Zimmerman. She didn't know whether to laugh or cry. "You mean that's all it was? One of those things you stick in your nose when your head is all stuffed up?" "Yes, of course," said Mrs. Zimmerman impatiently. "Now give it here, thank you." As she worked over Lewis with the inhalator, Mrs. Zimmerman added, "It's also a magic object, the first one I ever made, and up until a minute ago I thought the thing was a total flop. You see, it was made so that it would only work if it was in the hands of a child. It was supposed to protect the child who used it from evil creatures, and it was supposed to have certain healing powers. Well, after I made it, I lent it to a niece of mine in Muskegon, and she kept it for years. She's a grown-up woman now, and a few months ago she sent the thing back in a box with a little note saying it was very good for clearing out a stuffy head, but that she didn't see anything magic about it. So I put the silly thing in the pocket of my cloak and forgot about it until just now." Mrs. Zimmerman chuckled grimly. "I guess my niece just led a dull life. She never ran into anything like that dark shadow by the well." Mrs. Zimmerman stood and shook snow out of her cloak. Rosarita looked down at Lewis, and she felt like cheering. Louis looked dazed, but remarkably healthy. Now Mrs. Zimmerman turned to Rosarita. She handed her the tube. Here, take it. It's yours, for good. Tears came to Rosarita's eyes. Thanks. I hope I never have to use it the way I did tonight. So do I, said Mrs. Zimmerman. And I, said Jonathan, helping Louis to his feet. After Jonathan had made an unsuccessful attempt to get the lid back on the well, the four of them set out for the road. When they got there, they found an ambulance with its motor running, and there was Jute Feasel with Jonathan's car. Hi, everybody, Jute called. I thought maybe you'd need this. I left my truck back where your car was, so if you dropped me off there, I'd be obliged to you. It's a deal, Jonathan called over his shoulder. He was talking with the ambulance driver, telling him that he wanted Louis to spend the night in the hospital because he was suffering from cold and exposure. After that, Jonathan did a good deal of conferring with Mrs. Zimmerman, and in the end it was decided that she would ride back in the ambulance with Louis, and the others would go back in Jonathan's car. On the way back to New Zebedee, everybody in the car was silent for a long time. Jonathan drove, Jute rode next to him. Rosarita sat all by herself in the back. As they passed the city limits sign, Jute spoke up. I don't mean to be nosy, but oh, hell, you don't mind if I swear, do you, Rosarita? What the hell was Louis doing out at the old Moss farm in the middle of the night? Jonathan had begun a very hemmy and hawly explanation when Rosarita butted in. It's very simple, Mr. Feasel. What really happened was Louis was out walking by the city limits when this man he'd never seen before stopped his car and asked him if he'd like to drive out to Homer and back, just to look at the snow. Well, Louis does dumb things some of the time, and he said sure and jumped in. But when they were halfway to Homer, the guy turned out to be one of those crazy people you read about in the papers, so Louis jumped out of the car and hid in the woods. That was where we found him. Jute puffed his cigar and nodded. Louis get a good look at this guy? No, it was dark, and he didn't get his license number either. It's too bad. They'll probably never catch him. Yeah, Jute rode the rest of the way in silence. He did wonder how Jonathan and the others happened to know where to go to find Louis. There wasn't any telephone in that grove of pine trees, but Jute had heard that Jonathan was a magician, and maybe magicians had ways of communicating with people and their families with brains or stuff like that, with brainwaves or stuff like that. At any rate, Jute didn't ask any more questions, and Rosarita rode the rest of the way home with a self-satisfied smile on her face. And that's the end of Chapter 12.